Yo, what up? Going to record another video here going over kind of just some more specific feedback that I've developed over the past few days. The Hunter dev Nemox, I think is their name, or Nemox, has been pretty receptive in terms of like talking with the community and giving us, like thoughts on their philosophy from the dev and things like that of like why they're building the trees the way that they are and all this type of stuff, right? So that's been pretty cool, and I absolutely want to say right out the gate, I love the communication that they're giving and the amount of communication and the back and forth feedback, both ways and things like that. That we can feel like our voice is being heard and our feedback is being heard, and we're working together to make the spec more fun and more enjoyable and a better product in the end for like everybody to have fun and play with, right? Like, awesome, thumbs up from that. Don't want to like get the wrong impression that that is not something that I am praising, because I'm absolutely praising that. However, some of the communication I feel like has been missing the point that people are saying, or misunderstanding the point is maybe probably a better way of describing it. And also, I think there's some points that aren't being brought up that I wanted to bring up because there's something that I'm worried about that I haven't seen people talking about. So, first thing I wanted to start off with is the Trueshot post, and I should pull it up maybe if I was smart, but I didn't do this beforehand. But I should have done this. Maybe let's see if I can find it quickly. Probably not. But anyway, while I'm looking for it, basically the point of the post was that Trueshot itself doesn't feel strong as a cooldown ability, and also has some sort of mechanical issues, let's say, with the way that the spec plays and the way it functions, in that you ignore the precise shot stacks that you generate during Trueshot a lot of the time, simply because casting aim shot requires so much focus and so much cooldowns. Like the number of GCDs you have during Trueshot are spent on aim shot and then currently rapid fire primarily, and then steady shot for stuff like steady focus. Over the course of Trueshot, that you don't have time or focus in order to be able to cast the arcane shots. Focus is part of the problem, but it also is just time. Like, you physically don't have the GCDs. You would overcap on aim shot charges, which is a much bigger loss than losing out on the precise shot stacks. So the way that it functions feels bad. Like, it doesn't feel like the spec is synergizing with itself. It feels like it forces you to lose some aspect of the spec in order to gain in some other aspect, rather than the spec working together and synergizing and making the spec as a whole cohesively better and synergizing with itself and feeling like it, all fits, and it is, like I said, synergizing with itself. So, basically the feedback or the response from the dev was that Trueshot is not the strongest cooldown in the game, or 2-minute cooldown, whatever you want to say. However, if we were to increase its power level, that would mean we have to make your class relatively weaker outside of the Trueshot cooldown, and currently your class is stronger outside of the Trueshot cooldown to compensate for Trueshot being weaker. That's kind of the gist of what he was saying, and that they are fine with that. And I agree with this to some extent. Now, other classes already operate this way. Frost Mage, I think, is kind of like in a weird state of kind of always being in Icy Veins for a lot of time, and also not being reliant on their cooldowns at the same time in a similar way to Trueshot. And they have a very, I would say, flat or steady damage pattern as the way their damage breakdown goes. It's not a very like burst high spike and then low flatline, which is compared to something like Venthyr Balanced Druid has been earlier in this expansion. BM Hunter, very similar, pretty flat, steady damage, consistent, going to do about the same amount of damage in cooldowns, out of cooldowns over the course of a whole fight. There isn't a significant like disparity in the burst versus not. Similar to Havoc DH, especially Venthyr Havoc DH, very consistent. Meta is nice, but it's not like a massive cooldown where you spike like the highest damage in the game, for the 30 seconds or whatever that you're in meta, and then you're much lower for the other, 3.5, 4 minutes before the cooldown comes back. It's like, it's just steady the whole way through, right? So there's other examples of this that exist in the game already. So the Trueshot issue is a couple issues combined together into one. So one is that I think Marksmanship, as a spec, is currently not cohesive. It doesn't synergize with itself. Rapid Fire is a button that does damage and generates focus. That's what it does, right? But Steady Shot is a button that does damage and generates focus. So why do I have two buttons that fulfill the same purpose? Do they synergize with each other? No. They have no relation to each other at all. I just have two buttons that do the same thing. Aim Shot is a button that does damage and costs focus. Arcane Shot is a button that costs damage, or that does damage and costs focus. Why do I have two buttons? Okay, but you can see that Aim Shot fuels into Arcane Shot, right? Those two spells work off of each other. And because you're spending focus on those two abilities, then you need a button to generate focus to fuel those two abilities. So that's where something like Steady Shot comes into. But just pressing Steady Shot is kind of boring, so they gave us a different button to press where this is your priority Steady Shot button. What this means is this is Steady Shot, but you want to cast this button before you're casting Steady Shot, right? That's all it does, because this does more damage than a regular Steady Shot. But it doesn't generate the same amount of focus, and it channels for 2 seconds, whereas Steady Shot is a 1.5 second cast time. So there's like a weird balancing act where I'm also generating less focus for the amount of time I'm spending, so that just kind of feels cognitively weird, even if it's numerically fine. I want to stress this. Numerically is not the issue with what I'm about to describe. The numerics are always going to be tuned. Like, they can make a spec that is complete, throw whatever darts at the wall for whatever abilities, and those are the abilities that's how the spec works now. You know, we got Frostbolt, we got Chaos Bolt, and we got, like Backstab, and that's the spec. And they can tune the numbers to make that spec do the same amount of damage as every other spec in the game, if they wanted to. Does it matter that those abilities don't synergize with each other at all? No, it doesn't. They could still tune the numbers to make that the case for like a PvE patchwork target dummy. Obviously, there would be other like reasons that spec would be awful for like PvP or Mythic Plus or whatever. Right? But just numerically, they can make a spec function and be numerically balanced if they want to. That's not the point of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it does feel weird to have a button that its role is to generate focus, but it generates less focus over the amount of time, but it's still a button that I priority use to generate focus, but it's not fulfilling its role as clearly as something like Steady Shot would, right? So to me, it would make more thematic sense. And what I mean is, like, from a design perspective, not talking numerically, from a design perspective. For example, if Steady Shot generated 7 focus and Rapid Fire generated 10 focus or 15 focus or 12 focus, right? Something like that. That would make thematically more sense. And then you can tune the numbers accordingly to make the rest of the spec work out to end up in the exact same place that it is currently, right? You could do that. So it feels weird that it's the opposite. Does that make sense? Hopefully you're following along with this. So now, tie that in to Trueshot, which is, during Trueshot, your priority is cast Aim Shot. Aim Shot is effectively the priority Arcane Shot, right? It's a button that you press before spending focus on Arcane Shot, because this does way more damage than an Arcane Shot, and it buffs the Arcane Shots that you're eventually going to have to cast anyway. The way to think about this is that there's a set amount of focus that you could generate over the course of a fight, and you want to spend as much of that focus and use it to fuel damage as directly as possible. So the focus efficiency of your damage, now time comes into this as a factor too. It's like, I'll do a separate video at one point in the future describing like how DPS specs function and why rotations end up being the way they are. But a lot of times specs come down to like a limiting factor or 1 or 2 limiting factors, which is, this is the thing preventing you from doing more damage with the spec. This is where the spec is limited. You have excess of other resources or other ways to generate resources if you had more of X. And whatever X is kind of the limiting factor, and that's the most important balancing tuning lever, where if that gets changed, that's what changes the spec from like radically, whereas you could change other things in the spec and it wouldn't affect the spec radically. So if you changed, for example, the Aim Shot cooldown timer, that is the kind of limiting factor for Marksmanship right now. That is what kind of fuels the entire rest of the spec. It determines how many precise shot stacks you generate, which means how many arcane shots are you firing, and how much focus you have, depending on, because you spend a certain amount of time per aim shot, right? So I don't know what the math works out to be. It might be 5, but I'm just going to say, let's say aim shot was a 10-second recharge time on the charges, right? That means over a minute you would generate and cast 6 aim shots, right? So then over the course of that minute, you have all that extra time, aside from the 6 aim shot casts, to cast between 6 and 12 arcane shots, because that's how precise shots works, is it gives 1 to 2 precise shot stacks. So you're casting 6 aim shots between 6 to 12 arcane shots, and the rest of time is spent generating focus, with either rapid fire or steady shot. You have other stuff like steady focus, which sometimes means that this buff is a higher priority than this buff, right? So there's some cool interplay there, although I feel like that kind of feels... It feels good that there is a decision making and a choice of like awareness of the spec in optimizing to have those sometimes switch. It's not always an answer one way or the other, but it also feels wrong sometimes that you're leaving this off cooldown when you could use it, but you're casting steady shots, which are kind of the inferior version of the spell that you want to be casting, but because this has a buff tied to it and this doesn't, that you're still incentivized and prioritized to cast this instead of this, right? Okay, so all that goes into being said. In Trueshot, the problem is the limiting factor of Marksmanship as a spec is aim shot charges. So Trueshot as a cooldown gives you more aim shot charges, reduces the cooldown of aim shot for 15 seconds, right? And it causes it to cast faster also, so it gives you more GCDs so that you can be able to spend all of this stuff without overcapping, in theory, hopefully, because time spent overcapping is aim shot charges that you could have been generating but are losing out on the potential to generate because you're sitting at 2 capped charges or whatever. And rapid fire also, the cooldown is reduced so that you can use rapid fire as definitely a priority steady shot, and you can use rapid fire only to generate focus to fuel all the aim shots that you're going to be casting. However, all those aim shots, you don't have enough focus or GCDs, both in terms of focus and time, GCD time, to cast the aim shots that precise shots get from this, right? So that's what I'm trying to demonstrate here, that Trueshot does not synergize with the spec. The spec says you're limited by aim shot charges, and you're limited by the amount of precise shot stacks you have, and the rest should be to spend focus. But because aim shots cost so much focus, is that when you reduce the cooldown of aim shot, you actually just increase the focus generation time, and you lessen the arcane shot casting time relatively compared to what it was before. You need to spend more time generating more focus just to compensate to be able to cast all the extra aim shots that you're generating, and the thing that time is being spent compared to what it was being spent on before is the arcane shots, because those are the least important aspect of the spec. And so it does feel weird also when you get into Trueshot. You think you want to be casting rapid fire on cooldown, but steady focus is actually still so important that it's more important to keep this buff up during Trueshot than it is to cast rapid fire on cooldown. So again, that feels kind of weird, right? But I think the worst part is that it definitely seems that the spec doesn't function properly when you aren't able to spend the precise shot stacks that you're generating, right? That is how the whole spec fuels itself. That is the core rotational thing that the spec is built around, is this relation: aim shot into precise shots and then generate focus to fuel that, right? Those 3 aspects are the spec. Imagine if you played Fire Mage, for example, and when you used Combustion, you weren't able to cast Pyroblast, or an instant Pyroblast or something, right? That would feel weird and wrong, right? The whole spec is built so that you crit and generate instant cast Pyroblasts. So why would, in the course of my cooldown, I be able to cast fewer instant cast Pyroblasts, right? That would just intuitively, it sounds so nonsensical and made up, and it sounds like an extreme example, but that's how Marksmanship currently functions, is the main foundational core pillar of how the spec functions is being ignored in our cooldown and does the opposite of what you would think it would do. It doesn't fuel the spec to do more of what it's built to do, it fuels the spec to do less of what it's built to do, right? And then, so basically what that translates into is the more time we spend in Trueshot, the fewer arcane shots we cast, right? Does that make sense? Hopefully, simplifying it down to that level. So then we get to this talent, which says the more you cast arcane shot, the more time you'll be in Trueshot. So does that make sense? This talent anti-synergizes with itself, right? Whereas compare this to something like Icy Veins, Icy Propulsion, where the more time you're in Icy Veins, the more haste you have, the more crit you're doing for longer periods of time to get more crits to fuel the Icy Veins cooldown to be shorter so that you can have more Icy Veins uptime to have more haste to cast more spells and get more crits to get more cooldown reduction on Icy Veins, right? Like, it all synergizes with itself. The cooldown synergizes with itself. This does the opposite. The more cooldown reduction you get from this talent, the less cooldown reduction you're going to get from this talent. And it doesn't make sense, right? Okay. Now also let's tie this in with the talk of PI and the whole controversy around that. I've made my stance pretty clear on our podcast and things like that. I don't think PI should exist in its current form in the game. I don't think it's adding really any positive value to the game, or it's adding at the very least more negative value than it is positive value. I think that's pretty concrete and generally widely agreed upon. But then you have a dev, so PI staying in the game, they've given their reasonings for why they believe it should be able to stay in the game. You want to have choice of whether to PI a healer versus a damage dealer in some portion of the fight if you're struggling with that. Never in the case of history has that been true, all of Shadowlands, that you would ever choose to PI a healer. What you would rather do is just bring an extra healer and keep PIing the DPS. That's what the answer has been in all of Shadowlands. And they have never done any balance adjustments to change that decision-making process. So it seems like they were fine with it. I doubt that they would do balance adjustments to change the decision-making, or that would magically no longer become true in Dragonflight. So that whole premise kind of it falls flat on its face. It's not evidenced in any reality that we've just experienced for 2 years. And so I think that was kind of a poor point to try and make. But anyway, but also it should be, it's your choice of, it's not just all about parse culture, right? That's the second game that Blizzard didn't invent. They're just wanting you to kill bosses. They want you to have the choice of who's best to PI on a certain fight. But then if you're telling a spec your cooldown is weaker intentionally, is it really a choice that you have to PI whatever spec you want anymore? I don't think it's a choice, is it? So the design of this spec and of other specs, as I already mentioned, Havoc, Demon Hunter, Frost Mage, BM Hunter, specs are being built in contradiction to the design philosophy of PI staying in the game. If PI is going to be in the game, classes need strong cooldowns. You need to have a reason that you would PI that person because they have a strong cooldown. You want to buff them during their cooldown, right? Cool. But you can't then say your cooldown is intentionally weaker than other people's. That doesn't make sense. It contradicts the design. It does not make sense. And so that feels bad because to me, I've spent all of Shadowlands not really being PI'd as a hunter. Sometimes you got PI on Stone Legion Generals. You might have got PI on Prototype Pantheon. That was about it. You didn't really get PI much else, aside from kind of those fights. The majority of all of Shadowlands, PI went on a Warlock, basically. And so, now you're telling me PI is a choice, we're keeping it around, we want you to be able to PI whoever you want, except basically what the dev just told me was except hunters. Except marksmanship hunters, I should be specific. Because our cooldown is intentionally weaker. And so PIing us during a certain cooldown window is less important because PI is going to not be buffing us as significantly as another spec who has a stronger cooldown that would abuse the value of PI more. So that's, I think, a frustrating contradiction of design philosophies that isn't cohesive or synergistic or logically consistent, internally consistent with itself that I've seen demonstrated so far. So that's feedback. That's a very long-winded way of giving that feedback, but I wanted to cover a lot of different aspects to it. So that brings me to the second piece of feedback that I have in this video, which is the main thing that I have not seen people talk about, because obviously there were other people talking about why Trueshot doesn't feel good, and they did kind of cover some of that aspect in the post and things like that. They did mention the awareness that not spending precise shot stacks feels weird. Just to summarize and clarify a little bit, basically, I think the spec would just make more sense, even if it's numerically the exact same as it currently is, if, for example, during Trueshot, casting aimed shot automatically fired an arcane shot which consumed a precise shot stacks, right? You can numerically balance that stuff however you want to make it work out to the exact same damage that it currently is. But it would just feel, thematically, design-wise, intuitively-wise, it would feel much better to the player because it wouldn't feel like your spec is working against itself in that world. Even if it was numerically the exact same damage we were doing right now, it would feel, the perception, it's not a numeric issue, it's a perception issue. I completely understand this. But your job as a designer isn't just to numerically balance the spec, it's also to make the spec be perceived as fun. Like, that is kind of your job, right? And so if the spec can be in the exact same place it is right now, but just perceived as more fun, I think you should make that change. That is, I think, your job as a designer, to be summed up in one sentence, if that's even possible. But that's the best I can do. So the other aspect here, which I've not seen people talk about, which is an issue that I'm foreseeing that I think could be an issue not just with Marksmanship Hunter, but almost every spec in Dragonflight so far, is what I'm going to call button bloat. And basically, the spec right now, as I already kind of mentioned, is, let's say 6 times a minute I'm casting aim shot, 3 times a minute I'm casting rapid fire, 8 times a minute I'm casting steady focus. I only have a few limited GCDs after that. Let's say I have 20 GCDs to cast precise shots, or arcane shots, I should say. Let's say I have 20 GCDs, and let's say all 12 of them are spent on precise shots buffed arcane shots. So I have 20 arcane shots I'm casting total in that minute-long duration of all those abilities and things like that, right? In a minute, 60 seconds length of time, I'm casting 20 extra arcane shots, and 12 of them are buffed by precise shots. That means I have 8 that are not buffed by precise shots, right? And I have the focus. It's in equilibrium. I spend as much focus as I generate during that course of time or something. Whatever it is. Maybe I need to cast 2 extra steady shots and 2 fewer arcane shots, right? Maybe it's 2 extra steady shots that aren't needed necessarily required from steady focus, and then maybe I cast 2 less unbuffed arcane shots at the end. So maybe it's only 6, right? Okay. What that means is, during a 60-second window of time in a fight, I have 6 what I would call fluff GCDs, or extra GCDs. They're superfluous. They're not core required fundamental parts of the spec. And those 6 GCDs could be spent on other abilities or CDs or whatever if I needed them to be. They could be cast on an Exhilaration, that's on the GCD and it shouldn't be. It could be cast on a Double Tap, it could be cast, which costs a GCD and doesn't particularly feel good, but it's fine. It could be cast on a something else, I don't know. Aspect of the Turtle for those 6 GCDs, something like that, right? And my spec still feels and operates and does numerically similar damage because those 6 unbuffed arcane shots they're a very minority of my damage. Like, they're maybe the last, 2% of my damage. I can do 98% of my damage without those 6 extra GCDs. Just the way that the damage breakdown works, right? Because they do so much less damage because they're not being buffed by precise shots. However, in Dragonflight, with the way that the talent trees are currently set up for many classes and specs, we gain a lot of buttons. Not just the buttons that we currently have in Shadowlands. So for example, on single target right now, MM is kind of a 4-button spec. You have aim shot, arcane shot, steady shot, and rapid fire. Those 4 buttons are your core rotation of the spec. And then you have the CD on top of it of like Trueshot or whatever. So it kind of depends on when and I wrote a big thread on Twitter all about this that goes into this in more detail that I've already explained, but I wanted to make a video just to have some visual relation to maybe visually demonstrate and help the issue get understood more clearly, and I can talk through it as well and be more long-winded about it rather than trying to fit it into tweets. Depending on where you decide the cutoff is for a rotation ability to become a cooldown, I think about 1 minute is about the time. So I would say Double Tap is like a 1 minute. It's on the borderline of being a cooldown, but it also is kind of a core rotational ability, right? So of those 6 extra GCDs in a minute, let's say 1 is spent on Double Tap, right? Now I'm down to 5 extra GCDs, and I'm not considering any lock and load procs or something right now. I have 5 extra GCDs now that are superfluous. Now I also have Volley, so that's a 45-second cooldown. Let's just say I cast that once a minute. Now I'm down to 4 extra GCDs. Now, I also might be resetting the cooldown of Rapid Fire, and those 4 GCDs are being spent on Rapid Fire, right? So those might come into play, and now I'm all filled up. I don't have GCDs to be spending on unbuffed arcane shots anymore. However, in Dragonflight, so this is all kind of stuff that we currently have in Shadowlands. We might not have Surging Shots right now, we might not have Volley right now, but let's say we're doing some sort of light cleave 2-target boss or something. I don't know, we don't have Chimera Shot, but whatever, right? This is maybe a talent build that exists. I don't know what situation it would exist, but let's just say it does. I've run out of the superfluous extra GCDs that I have in a fight to cast extra abilities. However, now I'm entering Execute. Now I need to be casting kill shots on top of that. So now I'm losing out on casting something else to cast the kill shots. And I currently don't have Serpent Stalker's Trickery in this build, so I'm also having to cast Serpent Sting 3 times a minute. And maybe kill shot is 6 times a minute, right? So that's 9 extra GCDs already. I have Explosive Shot I need to cast twice in a minute. So now it's 11 extra GCDs. I have Barrage, which I need to cast 3 times a minute. We're up to 14 extra GCDs. And I have Chakrams, which this is on a 45-second cooldown, but the other Chakrams is on a 20-second cooldown. So that's potentially 3 extra GCDs. So now I have all the GCDs that I could fit my spec in before, and let's say it was 60 GCDs, I filled up 54 of them in Shadowlands without the tier set. I understand currently the tier set gives you more aim shots and stuff like that. You aren't casting Arcane Shot as much. I'm talking the spec baseline without the tier set bonus. I have 54 out of 60 GCDs filled with core stuff that I basically have to do for my spec to function. In Dragonflight, I'm adding so many extra buttons, and they're on short GCDs as well. So, like in Dragonflight, you might not have picked volley, and you might not have had surging shots available to you, and you maybe had Wailing Arrow, right, in Sanctum of Domination or something. And maybe this is like more of a single target spec that you're playing with. So like this is something that you had in Shadowlands. This was how a spec functioned. You had a 1 minute CD, you had a 1 minute CD, but like that was fine. And you didn't have volley instead, but otherwise it was fine, right? The specs still kind of functioned. And maybe instead of Wild Spirit, which was every 2 minutes, you had Resonating Arrow. That was every 1 minute. So you had a little bit of leeway, but not much, right? But now if I'm adding in, now we don't have Serpent Sting, okay, so we're not necessarily up at 17 extra GCDs, we're down to only 14 extra GCDs. But what I'm saying is my spec currently only had room for 6 extra casts, and this part of the spec now is introducing 14 extra casts that I need to be doing. And so how do those fit in my spec? What am I losing out on? And my answer to this is, I think we end up in the same situation as Trueshot currently, where the thing that I'm going to lose out on casting to fit these other abilities in is I'm going to lose out on casting Precise Shots stacks by not casting Arcane Shot when I have Precise Shot stacks. And that feels wrong to me. Like, my spec is not only not synergistically functional in the Shadowlands version, but I'm getting new stuff in Dragonflight, which makes my spec's core, foundational, rotation, fueling cycle system, it makes that work even worse than it does, because I have so many extra buttons to press, and I have to lose out on the core rotation foundation of my spec, because I don't physically have the GCDs to be able to cast all the things that it's giving me, because it's giving me so many more buttons on short cooldowns especially. It's not that I just had Wailing Arrow, and now I don't have Wailing Arrow anymore. It's in place of Wailing Arrow, I'm getting Barrage, which is a 20-second cooldown, Chakrams, which is a 20-second cooldown, and Explosive Shot, which is a 30-second cooldown, and maybe Serpent Sting, which I'm having to manually cast. Right? And so that seems like a problem, is my spec shouldn't feel like it's going to be functioning worse because you're giving me too many buttons on too short of cooldowns, and all these buttons, none of these buttons, synergize with the spec, right? In a situation where I have a spec like this, when we had Wailing Arrow, it kind of synergized with Kyrian, Resonating Arrow, and Enfeebled Mark, the Conduit, and things like that, right? And so that kind of synergized with itself. None of this other stuff synergizes with how the spec functions. Explosive Shot is just a button that does damage. What does that mean? It's a reskinned version of Aim Shot or Arcane Shot. That's all this button is. It's a different button that's Arcane Shot or Aim Shot, whatever you want to think of it as. Which we already have that with Rapid Fire, and we already have that with Aim Shot and Arcane Shot. So why do I need a third button that's a reskinned version of the same thing? It's a button that costs focus and does damage. Okay, it does damage on AoE, it's a little bit different, right? And Multi-Shot makes Aim Shot the same thing. It's a button that costs focus and does AoE damage. Multi-Shot does that same thing. I don't have Multi-Shot or Trick Shots in this thing, but you get my point. Barrage is a button that costs focus and does damage in an AoE. Now this also is a 3-second channel, so it's not just 3 casts in a minute at 1.5 second cast time, it's actually eating 6 casts in a minute, effectively, because it's channeling for 2 times the length as any other cast, and it's on such a short 20-second cooldown. So this alone is probably the biggest offender in you physically will not have enough time to cast all of your spells off cooldown of your highest damaging abilities that are all just reskinned versions of the same ability that don't synergize with the spec in any way, right? Does Barrage interact with Trick Shots at all? No. Does Explosive Shot interact with Trick Shots at all? Kind of yes, kind of no. This just applies Explosive Shot. But it doesn't make taking this talent and taking Trick Shots any better with themselves, right? Neither does Barrage. Neither does Chakram, right? Now, Death Chakram generates focus, okay? So it's the same as Rapid Fire. Or it makes a 10% more physical damage debuff. Now, some specs have what I would call a window, and something like Resonating Arrow or Wild Spirits opens a window, where it means during this period of time you want to maybe prep for this window. Mage's Rune of Power is probably the easiest way to conceptually understand this concept, is you want to prep a little bit going into it, then press the button and then do as much damage to fit in that window as you can, because that window makes casting the stuff in that window better, and then you can start building up for the next window once it's gone, once the timer is out. Death Chakram makes a physical damage debuff on your target, makes them take 10% more physical damage. But the way the spec works is that there's no physical damage window opened by this ability. It's effectively this part of the ability is completely ignorable, and you would play the spec the exact same whether that line existed on the ability or not. It's just a numeric factor. It just makes the stuff do more damage, but it doesn't change your rotation in any way. It does not change your decision making in any real meaningful, impactful way. Now, the same thing is true of Trueshot, actually, where some specs, for example, like a Mage's Combustion, they have ways to bank charges going into Combustion. That's part of what makes that ability feel better, is that you feel the impact of your own decision making in the lead up to pressing that ability, not just after you press the ability, but before you press the ability. And all the decisions you've made in the previous 10, 20 seconds matter for the decisions you're going to be making 20, 30, 40 seconds from now in that combustion window that you're ramping up towards. You're holding, Phoenix Flame charges or Fire Blast charges or whatever, things like that, right? You're holding a Rune of Power maybe in the past. Now that it casts automatically at your feet, that's not the case. But anyway. But there's no window that you can prep for Trueshot. My spec does not allow me. I can bank one aim shot charge. That's all I can do going into a Trueshot window. And I can immediately, before the Trueshot window, cast 2 steady shots, so that I have focus going into the window, and I have just refreshed this buff, so I have opened and what that is not actually a Trueshot window, it's a steady shot window. I've given myself a 15-second window where I don't have to cast steady shot, and that allows me to do damage. Now this is just a button that makes that the abilities that I'm doing damage with better abilities, because I'm replacing arcane shots for aim shots, and those do more damage. But it's a window almost built more on steady focus than it is on Trueshot. And so that's basically my feedback is I foresee this as being an issue is button bloat, and we almost need pruning of the talent trees, I think, in terms of extra buttons and their cooldown lengths and things like that. But also, I just think these buttons are kind of boring because they don't synergize with any of the specs in any meaningful way. And that's kind of depressing. In a weird world where, for example, I don't have Lone Wolf and I have something else, maybe we're back in this world, I also might have Kill Command, which is on a 7.5 second cooldown. So all those, I had 17 extra GCDs, right? That wasn't even accounting for Kill Command. Maybe there's a weird world where Marksmanship doesn't play Lone Wolf and plays Kill Command, and this is a button you want to press. So now, on top of the 17 other GCDs, I'm pressing this, 10 times extra. So now we're up to 27 extra GCDs. I only have 60, and I need 54 of them just to do my spec normally, and now you're giving me all these other buttons which cost another half of my spec? It doesn't make much sense to me. So I think this is an issue that needs to be closely looked at and monitored and probably adjusted for and accounted for, that doesn't seem to be accounted for currently in the way that the trees are currently being built. And the way to measure this, like I said, is think of the amount of GCDs that this tree is adding to my spec. And it's adding, like I said, 14, maybe 17 GCDs worth of time that I want to spend. You ideally want all these buttons to be doing damage, and I want to be able to press them on cooldown, basically, right? That doesn't even take into account that I might need to generate more focus just to fuel the cost of some of these abilities, right? Because they also cost focus. Barrage costs 60 focus. That's a lot of focus, right? I might not be able to cast that on cooldown if I don't have the focus generated to it. So it might even be more than 14. But let's say it's 14 just to be conservative, erring on the side of caution, is I can look right now at my spec, how it functions in Shadowlands with the talent tree on its own. And I can see, on average, over the course of a fight, every minute I only have 6 arcane shots that I'm casting without the precise shots buff. So I know what that limit is. I know how many free GCDs I have to add to the spec on top of it. And it's about 6. Maybe it's 8. Maybe it's 10. I don't know. The number isn't important. The important factor is that that number exists and you can find it out. And currently I feel like the amount that's being added to the spec by the base spec, by just extraneous buttons that don't synergize with anything else, are higher than whatever that number is. That's my concern, my worry, and my feeling. It's not really a numeric thing right now, because I'm not sure one way or the other. But my feeling is that that is the case, is that we now have too many GCDs to spend on all the things that we actually want to be spending the GCDs on. Okay, this has been a very long video. Hopefully that clears it up. Like I said, you can read through this Twitter thread. I'll go through very slowly, and you could pause and read through if you want it. But hopefully I covered most of the same things in this if you really wanted to read that. But anyway, that is my feedback for Hunter for Shadowlands so far. Like I said in the other video the other day, I think the tree still needs work, but I think on top of this, there's some other key issues in philosophy that I think either aren't being addressed properly or maybe are being misunderstood or not being, the community hasn't been clear on their feedback on, or some of the stuff like this, I think just people haven't figured out that this is impacting the spec yet. And it's probably going to be figured out pretty soon, and it leaves us in a very yucky feeling situation, and I don't want to end up in that situation because I'm very excited by the talent trees themselves actually and the concepts behind them, and I want them to succeed. I think they can succeed very easily with just tweaks that they need in a few key places and things like that. But these are the things that you have to keep in mind. I'm sure Blizzard is probably already aware of some of these things, but in the event that they're maybe not as aware or concerned with some of these things immediately, hopefully me talking about them can put it on their radar and make them maybe double check and make sure that, oh yeah, that is actually not working out the way we need it to or whatever, and we do need to cut back on some of these abilities and figure out a better way to do this instead of just giving a whole bunch of buttons on short cooldowns, because that's actually going to break specs if we do that. And currently some of those specs are already borderline broken from the outset in terms of functioning properly, and they already might need changes. And then maybe if the change is that I have even fewer extra GCDs, maybe it's not 6 anymore, maybe it's only down to 2, then I really don't have the ability to fit all this extra other stuff. So that's all I got. Thanks for listening. Hopefully that feedback is, hopefully we get a good Dragonflight marksmanship out of this. That's all I'm hoping for in the end. And I'm hoping I'm helping it get there in whatever way I can.